Thank you very much. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Councillor Darren Sanders. I'm the Liberal Democrat member for Baffins, North Milton and South Copner, and I'm also the Cabinet member for Housing and Tackling Homelessness. Before I begin, I have a few safety pieces of information to read out for everybody who's here. So if the continuous fire alarm sounds, please evacuate this room and the public gallery by the stairwells. Do not use the lifts. Please assemble at the Queen Victoria statue in Guildhall Square. In order to comply with the fire marshal regulations of the Guildhall Trust, whose building we are using today, anyone who signed in at the Guildhall reception desk should sign out when leaving the building at the end of the meeting. If you didn't, you don't have to. This is also being live streamed, so for the millions of people watching, good afternoon. It does also mean that everybody speaking via a microphone will be on camera, and that includes those making deputations. We don't have, I think, an oral deputation this afternoon. Members of the press and public are also permitted to record the meeting on the understanding that it neither disrupts the meeting nor records those stating explicitly that they do not wish to be recorded. We do have a member of the public, and I'll ask him to introduce himself along with everyone else as we go along. You're an observer. Lovely. Well, he won't be seen either. That's all right. Excellent. Except by me. So, thank you for that. We believe in freedom around here. So, please, can everyone remember to use the microphones and remember to switch them off when they have finished. So, I will start on my left and then go around so that everybody can introduce themselves. Alison.
Alison Harper, Local Democracy Officer.
Stuart Lane, Strategic Procurement, Framework Manager.
Steve Groves, Head of Building Maintenance.
Nicola Clanahan, Head of Housing Community Services.
Adam Hardwick, Assistant Director of Buildings.
Alan Denford, Finance Manager.
Sam Rickard, Housing Regulation Manager with Private Sector Housing.
Sally Scattergood, Assistant Director for Housing. Colette Hill, Assistant Director for Neighbourhoods.
Rob Furman, Head of Community Safety.
James Hill, Director of Housing, Neighbourhood and Building Services.
And now for our one person in the middle row. That's you, yes, that's you. You're looking at me worried now, so don't worry about it. That's it, switch on the red button. That's marvellous. No, oh, nearly, there's that one. Well done. Lovely, and now for the front row, please.
Roman Dane, Councillor for Copner Ward. Spencer Gardner, Member for Drayton and Farlington.
Mary Vallely, Member for Cosham and Mimring.
Thank you for all that. And first, people who don't know, our friends and colleagues on the front row represent different political groups, and they will have a part to play as we trundle along. Now, we have a deputation, which is a written deputation from Mr. Martin Silman of the Portsmouth District Private Landlords Association, which is about item 6, which is the private sector fees and charges, even though it's about item number 4 as well. So I'm suggesting that before we go on to the presentation for item 4, Alison, that deputation is read out. Is that okay? And so it'll be read out, and then the officers can then reply to it if necessary for item 4. It doesn't need to be read out again ahead of item 6, even though it covers items on item 6, okay? Excellent. So I have one apology for absence, which is Trevor Lovett of the Residents' Consortium. He is ill. Now, for Mary Spencer and Ray and me, do we have anything interesting to declare? No. Good. I do, in that I live in a private rented accommodation and I live in a house of multiple occupation. However, I'm not affected by anything on item 6, I believe. So, there is an item that is mentioned in the previous minutes, which is not mentioned anywhere else on the agenda, but I will raise that when we get there, and that's about the ever-lovely compensation for national insurance, which I think is an issue when we get to item 6. So, we will move now to item 3, which is the Antisocial Behaviour Improvement Plan update. Rob and Colette, is this your particular bag?
It is.
Excellent.
Okay, so the purpose of this report is to update you on the City Council's housing, Portsmouth Homes, antisocial behaviour improvement plan and to demonstrate the progress achieved to date. I'll acknowledge that you've had time to read and digest the report. Portsmouth Homes has always taken ASB seriously, and the first part of the report sets out the context of the service ahead of the publication of the consumer standards by the Social Housing Regulator on the 1st of April 2024. As part of our self-assessment against these consumer standards, we identified a number of areas for improvement, which are detailed in section 5, the ASB improvement plan. In 5.2, actions 1, 2, 3 and 6 are now complete and embedded and progressing. Since we wrote the report, actions 5 and 9 have been implemented and the outcomes should start to filter through now. And actions 4, 7 and 8 are due for completion by the end of this month, and we are working on those at the moment. Some highlights of the improvements that we have made are the introduction of an action plan when a case is opened, and this is also reviewed as required as incidents may occur. We've introduced a tenant satisfaction survey at the close of each case. Of the 55 cases where we've carried out a tenant satisfaction survey, we're scoring an average of between 7 and 8 out of 10 on those 55 cases, and that ranges across all the areas of the questions. We've introduced manager case review process. We've looked at over 300 cases have been reviewed by managers since June last year, with the learning fed back to the housing officers or into the tenancy management group. And we've also more firmly established a new governance framework, which is shown in Appendix 2. The next steps are to complete the outstanding actions in the ASB improvement plan, and it should be noted that as we identify improvements, they may be added to the action plan, the improvement plan, sorry. We will analyse the outcomes of the satisfaction survey and the tenants' satisfaction measures to see if the changes we made have impacted on the outcomes for tenants and leaseholders. And officers will update the Cabinet informally at your regular briefings, and we intend to bring a further information report on this subject in September this year.
Okay, thank you very much for that, Colette. Rob, did you have anything to add to that at all? No? That's fine, thank you. Greg, what did you think? Or what does the Residents' Consortium think, more accurately? If anything, you're allowed not to think here. Elaborate on that lack of people. What do you mean?
Well, there's only a certain number of officers on duty at any time, and they have to cover quite a wide area. Okay. So, if there's a problem in one part, they've got to find someone who's close enough to that part, and by the time they get there, the problem may not be there. Okay. It's a manpower issue as much as anything else.
Are you just saying it's a lack of coppers?
and the officers that work for the council.
Okay. The lack of coppers thing is sadly out of our control. But okay. We'll come. Colette and Rob, is there anything that you've looked at with regards to that? Is that fairly common or what?
Well, most of our ASB management is after. It's as it's reported, and we're not necessarily a response service. The housing team will address any issues that are raised with them, but that would be very rare that we would rush out to groups of youths or anything like that, except for our estate warden service and our community warden team, which are out and about in blocks in the evening. And what we do try to do is target those areas where we're having issues. So if it's a one-off, then yeah, we probably won't make it out in time if they've just been a bit silly. But if you're having repeat problems, then that should be escalated to your housing officer, and then they will help us understand where we need to send our community wardens or estate wardens for additional patrols. So I would just encourage you to report any issues, because the more issues that get reported, the more we'll understand where we can deploy our resources.
Okay, thank you for that, Colette. I want to come back to a version of that. Not that point, but a version of that point when it gets to us. So, was that it, Greg?
That's exactly the problem. It's a one-off, and it comes quite often, and there isn't anyone to get there. I mean, I personally don't have problems because I'm 6 foot tall and I'm a bruiser, so I go out and deal with it, but I can't go anywhere else. And a lot of the tenants are concerned because it is a one-off and it's and they're in the same situation that they don't want to go and deal with it.
I think that point has been well made, and I want to come back to a slightly related point to that when it is my turn, which is at the end. But that's okay, Greg. That's wonderful. Thank you very much. Ray?
No, I answered all my questions the other day, so I'm fine.
Okay, thank you. Spencer?
Nothing for me, thank you, Chair.
Mary? Okay. I did want to come back, because although I don't necessarily, I understand Greg's point, but I may not necessarily always agree with it. I think that there are several issues that do need to be unpacked, which are in this report. Firstly, it is very, very pleasing that 6 of the 9 identified actions have been completed, and that the other 3 are going to be completed in 9 days, which is what the end of the month is, which is, if true, is highly impressive, I have to say, because that will give us some help going forwards. One of the things I pick up when people come to me is around the communications aspect, which is mentioned in the reports. Because very often, you're right, people want it all done now, and they don't really worry about anyone else. But one of the other problems is about the ability of this authority to solve the problem, which is actually one of the things you were talking about, Greg. Because we all know there's not enough coppers, okay? We just know that. And you don't need to live on a housing estate to know that. That's something that we as councils, I'm sure, pick up all the time, the consequences of there just not being enough coppers around. So that's a problem. I chose to put people's rents to help fund the warden scheme so that we could double it. So we could actually have them on council estates, which wasn't the case before, partly because we knew there was a problem. But some of the problems are really difficult to deal with and become quite intractable and taxing, and that's one of the things I'm interested in going forward. So if, say, for instance, people come to us about noise, the dog upstairs is having a moan, or somebody's banging on the floor, then what usually happens, that's not actually the housing team, that's more an environmental health issue. The housing team will go around and try and help, but it's very often a housing issue, environmental health issue, and that's where it gets difficult, because sometimes one of the things I get, is people coming to me and going, yeah, that's lovely, but the person doing the complaint has told me it's me, and so there's a reprisal. Even though there is no way that happens, because notes do have to go out to say there's taping machines and stuff, people make assumptions. And that's not fair, and that's not right, and that puts the environmental health team and the housing team under a disproportionate amount of pressure, when it can't necessarily be dealt with. And people just want it to be dealt with. So it makes it difficult, and that's why I understand a related version of your point. But not everybody can tackle everything all the time, and that's why we have things like the Portsmouth Mediation Service to go in and actually try and talk to people. That doesn't work all the time, we know. But it is very difficult, and we know it can be embarrassing, but I think some of the points you raised may be fair, but I think that Colette is right in that some of the things can be dealt with as part of neighbourly disputes. Colette, did you have anything else? You're looking at me.
I was just listening, Darren. That's fine.
My good grief, I'm glad someone listens. That shows me up no end.
No, just that I think it is I do understand that one-off incidents can be irritating and difficult to live with. We understand that. But if they are really one-off, then that does kind of pass quite quickly. If they're not, then I just really, really encourage residents to let us know, because that's how we can work out what the best way to tackle that is.
And we get the same from the police. There are people who just won't report things to the police because they think nothing happens. But if the police don't have any evidence, nothing will happen. And it's a bit of a vicious circle, so I would encourage you to pass back to other people in the consortium and in your own area where that's come, to just report it as often as possible, even if they think nothing happens, and even if strangely nobody's evicted the following day. It's the sort of thing that will happen. Yeah? But Greg, thank you for that, and keep going with that. But yeah, so all in all, this seems like a pretty good report. And I'm looking forward to the 28th of February at 5 p.m. when the other 3 actions are implemented. So on that basis, thank you very much, Colette and Rob. Either of you can go now if you wish. If you don't wish, lovely, stay here. Okay, the next item is the self-referral to the housing regulator and subsequent regulatory judgment. This is report 3 to this meeting on this particular issue. I understand Nicola will do the report, but before she begins, Alison, could you read out the full deputation from Mr. Silman at the Landlords Association, please?
Okay. On EICR's IET, the Institute of Engineering and Technology produces the British Standard BS 7671 that provides the guidance on EICR frequency that all electricians follow. On EICR frequency, it differentiates between owner-occupied and rented domestic premises. It does not differentiate between types of landlord for rented domestic premises. All rented homes in social as well as private sector should have been on a 5-year cycle already some years ago. Your presentation that Portsmouth moved from a 10-year EICR testing cycles to a 5-year testing cycle from January 2024 implies compliance, when in reality all it actually says is that the majority of homes are in breach of the guidance and you are taking no action to rectify that other than waiting for each property to fall due, at which point the next test date will be in line with guidance. So it could be 2034 before you meet the IET guidance introduced in 2018. As before, the real concern for my members is the difference in treatment and enforcement of such rules between the social and private sectors, and the concern for tenants who may unknowingly be living in unsafe conditions. And on the other agenda item of interest, HMO licensing fees, we are somewhat incredulous at the 11% increase, given that, for example, Southampton can provide a licence for less than half the current Portsmouth fee. And if you remember, when the original prices were set at Cabinet and I complained, you did promise to review and to come back in 6 months when the scheme was introduced with a view to making the cost less onerous on those landlords who were compliant. I guess it is down to the much reduced number of HMOs. Would be nice for your team to finally concede their 6,000 estimate was misleading, and the planning for those volumes has contributed to today's high costs. And just to be clear, those costs end up as rent increases, so an 11% increase will have an impact on Portsmouth rent levels and tenant affordability, dumping yet more people into the emergency accommodation poverty trap.
Was that it, Alison?
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mr. Silman. I understand he was going to be watching on this live stream, so good afternoon to you as well. I think with regards Sam and Sally, the stuff with regards to the HMO licensing fees, please deal with later on as we go along. Given his presentation, I now have to do for item 4 that I live in a private rented property, because he mentioned that in the context of this. So I understand Nicola will do the most of the presentation, but Adam and Steve, if during any sections you do on this, you could try and respond, if you can, to any of the points. Any or all of us may follow up with questions as we go along. Nicola.
Thank you. The purpose of the report is to provide an update on work completed following the City Council's self-assessment against the housing standards, which resulted in a self-referral to the Regulator of Social Housing in September 2024, and sets out the improvement plan which responds to the recent regulatory judgment by the regulator. Following the publication of the Charter for Social Housing, there's been significant change to the social housing sector, and there continues to be change that social housing landlords must respond to. Portsmouth Homes has had an ongoing action plan in response to the changes, working closely with resident representatives, and reports have flowed through this meeting as updates and decision reports, with examples set out in page 2 of the report. Following publication of revised housing standards and a code of practice applicable from the 1st of April 24, Portsmouth Homes further reviewed all work areas to understand compliance with expectations and areas that needed to be evidenced. This assessment was further informed by an information request from the regulator, and in line with expectations set down, Portsmouth Homes made a self-referral to the housing regulator, updating this meeting and all residents and staff in doing so. The self-referral acknowledged that a robust costed plan was needed to address building issues, and there was a requirement to complete individual stock condition surveys and annual tenancy update visits. Following a period of engagement in which data and narrative was provided, the regulator issued Portsmouth City Council with a regulatory judgment in respect of the safety and quality standard, with the finding at a C3 grade. The judgment recognised Portsmouth Homes' transparency in making a self-referral and acknowledged the ongoing improvement plan to improve the position. The judgment references 4 areas where continued improvement is necessary: a lack of up-to-date stock condition surveys with HHSRS assessment not included until 2024, outstanding fire remedial actions, of which a small number were high risk, the age of electrical safety certificates with an inability to monitor completion of actions, and a lack of clarity for tenants around what can be expected from the repairs service, with a lack of assurance that there is adequate oversight of performance in that area. As part of an ongoing monitoring of our improvement plan, Portsmouth Homes will meet with the regulator, with the first meeting on the 4th of March, and we expect there to be monthly improvement meetings. As of mid-January 25, 28 local authority landlords had received a regulatory judgment, with 16 receiving C3 grading and 2 receiving a C4. Alongside gaps in compliance, a recurring theme is a challenge of effective data collection and record keeping to evidence compliance and outcomes, and so provide assurance of practice to the regulator. The areas noted on C3 judgments demonstrate a broad range in the degree of compliance. In conversation with the regulator, it was indicated that Portsmouth Homes was borderline C2, and as such, the improvement journey may be shorter than that of others. However, we do expect to be inspected alongside all social housing landlords holding 1,000 or more properties, and it will be that inspection which looks at all of our services against the full breadth of the consumer standards. The report moves on to address the areas noted in the improvement plan with explanatory information, and section 4.4 discusses Portsmouth Homes' approach and how assurance is gained locally that overall its housing stock is a reasonable condition. The report notes the improvements that have been made since the self-referral in September 2024. This is provided in brief in Appendix D, which sets out the updated position as of the 31st of January 2025. I'm going to pass over to Adam at this point just to explain in more detail the judgment and improvements.
Thank you. As the judgment focuses on the safety and quality standard, I'm basically going to go through each of the main areas around fire risk assessment actions, electrical inspections, stock surveys and repair information to hopefully provide a bit more context and clarity around it. So I'll start with fire risk assessment actions. So in terms of just some background, we're required to undertake a fire risk assessment to any block of flats where it has a communal area. We have a total of just over 1,100 blocks of flats, of which around 820 need a fire risk assessment because they've got common parts. Generally, all those blocks do have FRAs in place, so I think currently it's about 99.88%, and it's just a timing process for that one, which is out of date currently, but that usually stays around 100%. In terms of the judgment, it acknowledged that there was just over 1,000 actions that were out of date at the time of the self-referral. I think it's important to clarify that we've always proactively addressed actions. So to the year to date, we've addressed 2,336 actions coming out of fire risk assessments, and that's an ongoing process. In terms of some of the background though, what we've seen in recent years, following the introduction of the Building Safety Act in 2022, it's changed the scope of a fire risk assessment. So previously it just focused on the common parts of the buildings. They are more onerous and cover more areas of the building. So they now include looking at the external walls of the building, and also for the buildings that fall within the scope of the Building Safety Act, so that's ones over 7 stories, the FRA in the assessment covers the entire building in its entirety. So because of that, that's looking at areas that were previously outside of the scope of fire risk assessments, and as such are generating additional actions from that. We're also seeing, in terms of fire risk assessors, there's a lot more caveats and additional areas of inspection or investigation within that as actions that may have not previously been included. In terms of the actions themselves, that they vary in terms of the level that they come in at. So you could have, as an example, 2 high-risk actions. So one high-risk action may be to remove some waste materials that are maybe stored in a communal area, and then another action could be to replace the fire doors in a block of flats. So obviously, if they're the actions presented, removing that waste is something that we can do very quickly. However, replacing all of the doors in a block of flats is a longer-term process, particularly if it relates to some of our taller buildings. There's a new building control approval process which goes directly through the building safety regulator. That is bringing in a more robust process for building control, but with it, it's taking a lot longer to progress. So some of those actions cannot be progressed in the timescales defined, even though we are proactively addressing them. I think it's important to make clear that whenever we receive an FRA, we will review it and we will review all the actions accordingly, and then we will consider if any mitigation is required in the short term to ensure the safety of the residents until those actions can be addressed. An example of that could be that we may undertake repairs in the short term. We may change some of our management processes. So this could be around undertaking additional block inspections or communicating with residents. And in some circumstances, we may change the policy of the block from a stay-put policy to a evacuation policy, depending on what the risk is. And also, with all the actions as well, we will prioritise them based upon risk. So this could be around how tall the building is, how many escape stairs there are, what the use of the building is, and the ability of residents obviously to evacuate. And again, to give some context on that, we could have 2 recommendations for different blocks. One could be to replace fire doors for a 2 or 3 story block of flats. We could have another recommendation to replace fire doors for a 20-story block of flats. In that instance, we would prioritise the works obviously to the 20-story block, as there is a high risk there. We are making changes and continue to make changes. So in 2022, recognising the Building Safety Act, we've established a Pacific Building Safety team, and we're resourcing to that. And that is focused primarily on managing the building safety cases, and we've brought reports to this meeting to share the outcome of some of the building safety cases we've done, which are also obviously communicated to residents as well. We've changed the structure of building services, introducing a new compliance area, and we appointed a new head of compliance in October 2024, which is giving greater oversight to all compliance activities and, in particular, building safety. And there's further reprofiling of staff budgets to provide additional resources in that team. A key aspect coming out of some of the FRA actions, which will play through in March, is I'll be bringing the HRA revenue and capital allocation budget report, and within that you'll see a building safety remediation programme which funds a significant amount of work over the next 5 to 7 years to address some of the larger scale actions arising from our fire risk assessments. If I move on now to around the electrical inspections, so again, just to provide some clarification around the sort of historical process and sort of where we've moved to now. So within social housing, there is not a legal defined timescale to undertake electrical inspections to properties. Prior to January 2024, when we changed our policy, we would undertake electrical inspection of the property sort of as necessary, and from that, within the certification itself, an electrician would do the inspection, and then they would on the certificate it says when is the next inspection recommended. Generally, that tends to be a 10-year cycle. In some situations, they may put that as a 5-year or less, depending on whether there's issues with the property, such as either the current installation or potentially if the resident was a hoarder or something, it may increase the risk. And obviously, if they put a shorter time scale for review, we would adhere to that. In the private rented sector, there are regulations that are brought in that require them to inspect properties on a 5-year cycle. And basically, from our perspective, in January 2024, we changed our policy, recognising it wasn't a legal requirement, but it reflected best practice to move towards a 5-year cycle. So from January 2024, we changed our policy that any new EICR undertaken would be on a 5-year cycle. When we've had the discussions with the regulator, the questions that they asked of us were how many properties were on a 5-year cycle and how many properties were on a 10-year cycle, because obviously they recognise that most housing associations or authorities would be working to a 10-year cycle. So in terms of the 15% number which is quoted in the judgment and our self-referral, that refers to properties where we've undertaken an electrical inspection post-January 2024, and on the certificate it would say next recommended inspection 5 years. The 85% relates to properties that were undertaken before January 2024, and on their certificate it would say next recommended inspection 10 years. So that's the conversations we were having with the regulator and the data we provided to them. What that means is, though, is that if we had an inspection undertaken in December 2023 or in 2022, it would be within 5 years, but the cycle it would be on would be a 10-year cycle. There's a slight discrepancy in terms of the wording of the judgment. In terms of the question for the judgment has changed slightly. They're referring to electrical inspections that are over 5 years old. So that's different to the question around cycles. So in terms of our actual our number of inspections that are within 5 years, it is currently 58.6% of properties have an electrical inspection within 5 years, albeit that some of those on the certification will say next inspection 10 years. I think that's an important point to clarify, because it does change the narrative of what's said in the judgment significantly. During the process of liaison with the regulator, this was they gave us the draft judgment and we clarified a number of points, one of which was around electrical inspections. Some points were modified, but the electrical point wasn't. We've obviously shared this February report with the regulator, and we're meeting with them on the 4th of March, as part of our sort of improvement journey, and we'll obviously discuss that further. I think going forward, we're already moving to a 5-year cycle, and you'll see again in the March sort of budget allocation report, we are allocating funding to electrical safety to accelerate the programme to move in a more timely manner to ensure that all properties have electrical inspections within 5 years. Next point I will cover is around stock surveys. So within the consumer standard that were brought in April 2024, it defines that we have a requirement to have a stock condition survey at an individual property level, obviously for every property. Again, in terms of the context, we have around 15,500 properties where we are responsible for the full maintenance and internal provision of that property. So that means that we need to get into a position of having 15,500 surveys undertaken, which is a significant task from the 1st of April. In terms of what the regulator is looking for, is obviously documented evidence that we've got undertaken those surveys and we've managed the risks around that. Prior to the consumer standards changing, we do hold an awful lot of data around our properties. This could be stock data, it can be repairs data, it could be energy performance information, etc., that we've previously used to manage the maintenance and the condition of the properties. However, what we don't have is a single point of a stock condition survey for each individual property. So this is a position we're moving to, And obviously that's a slightly different requirement to what we had previously. Again, in terms of mitigation, we typically get around 98% of our properties every year through day-to-day repairs, so we're in and out of those properties regularly. We've always done stock condition surveys at a level. We have repair surveyors that visit each property linked to day-to-day repairs. Obviously, if any resident raises an issue, we'll either send contractors there or we will visit ourselves. A contractor doing a repair has the ability to raise issues or add additional work if necessary. And when housing officers are doing tenancy update visits, again, if there's any issue with the condition, that can be raised as a repair. In terms of moving forward with the stock condition world, again, we've changed the structure of building services and established an asset management service now. That includes a stock condition team where their primary function is just to undertake stock condition surveys. Currently, that's resourced with 9 surveyors, and they're progressing through those surveys. And we've also got a team of data analysts that we are using to analyse the results of the surveys and better utilise data to inform and proactively address issues that may arise. Again, as a point of clarity, I think in the last 2 years we've done over 5,000 surveys, and what we've found is there's minimal issues arising from those surveys. So it's not like we've done the surveys and there's a lot of issues arising from it. I think it's sort of reinforced actually, the stock is in a reasonable condition. And the final point was around repairs, and this was around us being able to convey clearly to residents what they can expect from us in terms of a repairs and maintenance service, and also being able to report on our attendance of certain types of repairs, particularly around emergency repairs. So I think that there's a number of points on this again. In terms of reporting on emergency repairs, which we aim to either address or make safe within 24 hours, this is something that we've always done as part of our scope of service. The issue we had in terms of the regulator and our data returns was the way we recorded emergency repairs. They were linked to a number of other work items, so they might raise an emergency repair in terms of we don't have any heating, but at the same time they would raise an issue of can you adjust a door which is sticking. So the end-to-end time for that repair would include the entirety of those items. So we've had to change our process to basically only record emergency repairs as emergencies on their own repair ID, which is basically tidying up our data. So when we were engaging with the regulator, it was difficult to report that accurately. We've resolved that issue now, and our current response rate is over 99%, and we'd expect that to continue at that rate. And in terms of, again, conveying to residents about our scope of service and what to expect in terms of our repairs service, it links to the later report about our delivery model. But part of that is around us defining better, what is an emergency repair, what is a routine repair, what residents can expect in terms of when we will attend, how quickly we'll address things. And again, we are working to improve that so that it's more transparent and there's a service standard that they can hold us to. I think that probably covers the key points. I'll hand back to Nicola.
Thank you. So section 4.9 of the report discusses the oversight and governance of building safety work within Portsmouth Homes. Data management is a key area under consideration across the service so as to ensure that compliance with regulation can be evidenced. Portsmouth Homes is working with an external consultant to review current IT and develop an understanding of what's required moving forwards. Alongside the areas referenced in the regulatory judgment, Portsmouth Homes self-assessment also identified other areas for improvement, and these have not yet been considered by the regulator. These are set out in section 5 of the report. Progress is being made with the improvement plan in place, with the update report on ASB being an example presented in this meeting, and a further wider report is planned to come forward in the early summer. The report concludes with the discussion of the oversight of the improvement plan, noting that data reports to members have been renewed and that the lead member, senior members, wider members and internal audit will all receive updates and be able to scrutinise performance better. Updates will also be provided internally to staff and to residents consortium through resident focus groups and through House Talk magazine, ensuring Portsmouth Homes continues to be open about its performance and the areas identified for improvement. And we'll move to questions if there are any. Thank you.
Right, thank you very much for that, Nicola and Adam. Mr. Anderson, did you have any comments at all? Or questions? Or both?
No, you went through this very thoroughly at the residents' meeting, and they completely understand the situation with not being able to prove what is being done because we need a new IT system. And until we've got that, it's always going to be difficult. And fortunately, the group of people there, I think they realise that. And I'm grateful for that.
I think that I will come back to that later. Thank you for that, Mr. Anderson. Mary.
Just to say I appreciate the hard work that's gone on, and we will get there. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. I was going to give time to Spencer to finish his water, which you don't see on the live stream, you lucky people.
I sped up there drinking that for
I
for
don't
you, Chair.
know less of that.
A wider question in terms of the council's role with the other hat on when we've got responsibility for regulating private landlords. Does any of this impact on our ability or efficiency in terms of completing that, other than the odd comment to be expected from a private landlord along the lines of what we'd imagine? Is there any disadvantage or issue created on the other side?
I'll take that one.
Thank you.
The short answer is no, because they are completely different parts of the service. So we have a private sector service which is resourced to deliver the services to the private sector around, licensing, enforcement, monitoring and support for landlords and tenants. This service that we're talking about is the Portsmouth Homes Service, which is funded purely from the HRA. It's a completely separate service, so it doesn't impact our ability to deliver the service to the private sector enforcement side of things.
I take that point, but isn't there the risk that if somebody's in court, whilst the services are separate, they still might be tempted to waive this decision in front of a judge and say, well, hang on a second, who are they to be telling us what to do, or even, this is really tough, there's challenges, judge me by that standard. I've not got my own observation on whether or not that's an attractive argument. Could we have some thought, if it's not been done already, about briefing the team, which are separate, which I accept, about the possibility of that and how to respond? Because there is an explanation, I know, but behind that, and an explanation about the two being different. I just worry that, yes, they are separate in principle, but in reality, there might be an issue. I don't know if some thought's been given to that already, but if it could.
Yeah, I mean, we have already done some briefings with the team around, how to manage those conversations, and we do completely understand that we will continue to receive some of that challenge, and the team have been briefed on how to manage those sort of conversations. Yeah.
I think that Sally, sorry to interrupt Spencer, I think that Sally Spencer raises a fair point, actually, because we get this quite a lot, particularly with planning decisions, and there's the role of the local planning authority, which is entirely separate. Oh, thank you, Mary. I'm so glad we've got a fellow traveller here. Which is entirely separate to the council's role in terms of development. So you have a very odd position, which we had with, say, Summers Orchard, whereby the council is the developer and the planning authority. And you're right to say that there are always some people who think that there will be what they describe as backhanders or some form of corruption because of that link, which doesn't exist. But it is a fair point. But I think there are issues there that we can tease out as we go along. But I think that's the closest comparison we can give, really, and that the two things are separate. They also come from separate budgets as well. So the work of the regulatory work comes from council tax and government grants, whereas this comes from people's rents. So there is a fair amount of Chinese walls. But it's a fair point, Spencer, and I think we'll come back to that as we trundle along, because I think that's the heart of some arguments there. Anything? Sorry to interrupt you, Spencer. Any other questions or comments at all?
I'm grateful. Just very briefly, in terms of the regulator review meeting, so the monthly meeting, the first one on the 4th of March, could I just understand a bit more about how that happens and what's going to happen there? So where's the meeting? How long is it scheduled to last? Is it half an hour? Is it all day? Is it officers? Is it officers and members? So I've taken note of how it's going to be fed back to us, but I was just interested on what information we had at this stage about the format of the meeting itself. Do we set the agenda do they set the agenda, or do we just not know yet until we get closer to the meeting?
I think at that first meeting, we'll be in conversation with the regulator to understand what that's going to look like. The usual meeting with the regulator is with assistant directors and with James, having conversations and providing data returns to them in advance of that meeting, and then them setting agenda and questions for us to respond to. But what they have said is that they'll align their meetings with our reporting and our governance structure. So rather than creating a new system or a new channel, it will complement what we're doing in terms of reporting to Councillor Sanders and yourselves.
It's helpful, thank you.
Okay, any other questions or comments? But no, thank you. Ray.
Just one for Adam, actually. On the electrical checks, the ones that were on a 10-year cycle, I take it they are now fully on a 5-year cycle. And can you just confirm that basically that there was no legal requirement for us to be on a 5-year cycle when we were on a 10-year cycle, just to make it perfectly clear for people?
Yes, so in terms of, we will have certificates that may have been done, say, like 9 years ago, and then obviously they've got their date for inspection. On our programme next year, we'll obviously be working from the oldest certification, and then obviously increasing that to 20%, and then doing those ones going forward on that. I think it's also, a couple of other points on that, is within the certification you have a C1 and C2 actions, which are basically around sort of safety of the property. Our policy, and it's always been our policy, we do them at the time of inspection. So, you know, when that inspection's done, that property is safe, and we've addressed any issues there. And we also do like yearly inspections as well of all of our properties, to a visual inspection of the electrical installation, just to make sure that there aren't any issues present, such as broken sockets, etc., which then we would raise. And yeah, and on the final point about the legal requirement for social housing, that there isn't a defined timescale around, you know, you have to do it in this time. They're looking at that, and that's being reviewed, and potentially that will change in the future. And obviously we'll respond and work to any legislation that comes in.
Yeah, cheers. It was mainly more for clarity, because it was in a very long sort of conversation you was having with yourself over there. So basically it was more of a clarity rather than what's name. Cheers, Adam.
Okay, thanks, Adam. My turn, and I want to turn to some of the issues that are raised in the deputation, if that's all right. The first is around a comment which says there is a concern from the Landlords Association for tenants who may unknowingly be living in unsafe conditions. I'm going to focus on the electrical surveys, because that's the only point they seem to have raised. Is doing it every 10 years unsafe?
Look, like I've mentioned, when we've done the electrical inspection, we address all actions necessary at the time that make the property safe at that point. The way our repair service works as well is demand-led. So any resident, if there is an issue of any sort with the electrics, they can obviously phone up, and we will repair that as necessary immediately, because that would be classed as emergency repair. We also, as I outlined, I think around some of the stock survey information, we have a range of other measures that we can use to, improve and ensure safety of properties. So, we've introduced tenancy update visits. So a housing officer is going to, properties regularly, and they will do a visual inspection. If there's any repair issue there as well, obviously surveyors or contractors, it's in their scope to review that. We do the visual yearly inspection as well through our contractor as well. So again, that's another mitigation. So all of these items together, I think are reasonable steps to ensure that the properties are safe ahead of a formal electrical inspection.
Okay, I'm guessing the answer to that question is no, which is on its own, it doesn't. I think the next bit, you talked about a visual inspection that occurs every year. No, sorry, I know the answer to this, so I'm just checking this for clarity. So there's a visual inspection of the properties every year, correct?
Yes.
Correct. So in other words, you're going to people's homes every year to check and see it's all right. Okay, that's slightly different to the private sector. The next bit is around the paragraph above, which is talking about this 5-year testing cycle and the Institute for Engineering and Technology saying there's a 5-year cycle. Although the judgment talks about 15% meeting the 5-year cycle, we now have 58.6%. And again, I know the answer to this, but I want clarity for everybody. I'm assuming that I think I know that 58.6% essentially is things that have been done since February 2023. No. Where does the 58% of the 5 years come from? And I may have misunderstood what I thought I knew.
The 15% relates to electrical inspections undertaken post January 2024
right.
that are under our new policy, which is a 5-year cycle. That was the conversations and the data requested from the regulator. In the judgment, they've said they've looked at a 5-year, how many certificates were undertaken within 5 years and how many post 5 years. That's different to our 5-year cycle question. So when I'm saying 58.6%, if you go back 5 years from today, 58% of properties have had an inspection undertaken.
Right. Sorry, I got the years wrong. So it's since February 2020, in other words.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. All right. You're right. That's significantly different, and reputationally and in publicity terms is significantly different, because that also says that again, according to this deputation, that the majority of homes are not in breach of the IET guidance on this. That is correct. Thank you. I'm getting a nod there just in case nobody sees Adam nodding. So therefore, the majority of homes fall within this IET standard that is mentioned by the deputation. Correct?
Yes. Yeah.
That's okay. You could have nodded your head as well. That's absolutely fine. Okay. That's a significant difference and a significant improvement from that. And I think that will give people some confidence in what is going on. I've said a fair bit of this in the press and in the media, so forgive me if I say it again. But I think for many people, what they see in this judgment is not necessarily what they see in their homes. Our tenant satisfaction measures for things like repairs are 10 points higher than housing associations. That's not bad. A scrutiny panel looked into the quality of our repair service and found it to be miles better than that of housing associations. And that had nothing to do with anybody in the cabinet. That was done mainly by opposition councillors. So, it must be true. So I think what people see is different to what is in here. But what is in here is a wake-up call in certain areas, particularly around data, particularly around the need to have the right processes. Many of the things changed with the social housing regulator, where the deputation talks about the difference in treatment and enforcement of rules between the social and private sectors. That's true, because there are many differences imposed by government. We, in the social housing sector, have been forced to run to the decent home standard, for instance. The private sector hasn't. We have rent caps. They don't. In fact, governments are very keen for them not to have rent caps, whereas we're about 2.3% short in terms of actually being able to balance our budgets, whereas the private rented sector can increase rents if they've got a problem. So there are key differences there between the two sectors. And I think the lack of clarity which the regulatory judgments have given helps let everybody know where they're going. And that's very, very important. Again, my understanding is that we are below a borderline as far as the regulator is concerned, and that we'll work constructively and proactively over the next whatever months it is to get us through the playoff zone and into promotion to the championship, or as you call it, C2. Because I think we have a chance of doing that. But I think coming back to Spencer's point around the difference between the two, we will work constructively. Being a regulator means that when you get regulated, you don't set up war rooms. What you do is you work constructively and proactively and accept the regulator's judgment and work to improve, not just in the areas where they've highlighted significant concerns, but in all areas that we have identified as possibly falling short of what the regulator wants. So we accept the judgment. We'll work constructively and proactively to get out of the League One playoffs and into some form of promotion. We may or may not get there, I don't know. But I hope we will. And it will mean altering the budgets to make sure that we get there, as Adam has outlined, because that's the first thing we've got to do. So it's a sobering report in many ways. For some people, it won't reflect reality. For some, it will. For many, it won't. But what we've got to do is to treat the regulator with the respect it deserves and make sure that we can continue to deliver a decent service for everybody. So on that basis, I can't decide this report, Alison, I believe, but I will note the report, and I look forward to regular feedback to me and to my opposition colleagues on how we get on. But thank you very much, Alison and Adam, Nicola and Adam, for putting all that together. And if anybody has any further comments, particularly from our residents consortium colleagues, feel free to ask them outside this meeting.
No, it makes perfect sense, and the residents, believe it or not, are behind you.
Well, that's very pleasing to know, and I'm pleased they're behind us with no knives. That's always very handy, and thank you very much indeed for all that. So I suspect this one is going to run and run, but we look forward to the outcome of the 4th of March meeting with interest. Okay, you can go if you wish. You can stay if you wish. We don't mind. Next stage is the Park Homes pitch fee review. This is going to be marginally more exciting. I believe, Samuel, you've got this.
Yeah, that's with me. Afternoon, everyone. So this is a regular report brought forward for decision regarding the annual pitch fee uprating at the Council's Park Home sites. So they are Cliffdale Gardens and Henderson Park. The purpose of the report is to provide recommendations on the annual pitch fee uprating for Park Home sites in line with CPI. For context, the Council is the landowner of both residential Park Home sites, and residents of these sites are private owner-occupiers who rent their plot from the Council for a weekly charge, which is known as a pitch fee. Residents of these sites agree to a written statement when they purchase their home, which essentially forms the contract between themselves and the Council. Within that contract, residents agree to pay a pitch fee and are told how much is payable each week. This contract also outlines that fees will be reviewed annually. Fee income covers the Council's costs in running the sites, including staffing costs and all repairs and maintenance, as well as providing a contribution towards the Council's fixed overheads. Any unforeseen costs, such as major repairs to the site, cannot be recovered outside of the pitch fee income. A set procedure and legislation in place limits any increase in pitch fees to the applicable rate of CPI, which in this case is the rate published today at 3%. So because the actual increase was unknown at time of writing the report, because it was set to be published today, officers included an indicative fee increase and gross income figure based on the previous rate of CPI, which was 2.5% at time of writing the report. The actual rate published today is slightly higher than the previous rate, so just to outline what that looks like, in the report we gave an indicative figure, increase range between 97p and £1.22 per week, and again that's based on the 2.5%. Based on this morning's CPI release of 3%, the actual increase will be between £1.17 per week and £1.47 per week, or in other words, 20 to 25 pence per week difference compared to what was illustrated in the report. Maybe just for context as well, the rate of CPI applied in last year's pitch fee was 4%, so slightly higher than what's being recommended for this year. The report outlines several costs incurred in running the sites and highlights that staffing costs, water rates and building costs are all expected to increase in the new financial year, likely beyond the rate of CPI as published today. Therefore, officers still believe an increase in line with today's published rate of CPI is necessary in order to minimise any negative budget pressure that may occur. Officers will continue to regularly review the Park Home budget in the new financial year and, where necessary, flag any pressures identified that may impact the service's ability to meet its contribution to fixed overheads. No change in the service that residents receive is being proposed through this report. So in summary, although the CPI rate is slightly higher than the example given in the report, officers still believe the recommendations held in the report are necessary, and officers ask that the Cabinet Member for Housing and Tackling Homelessness agrees to increase pitch fees in line with the rate of CPI published today for the next financial year. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Sam. Mr. Anderson, did you have any? I realise it might be mildly outside the consortium's remit, but I am sticking to process here.
I wondered, is the pricing for the double pitch based on the size of the pitch or the number of people? Because I looked at the prices and I thought, they don't quite make sense.
It's the size of the pitch.
So it's bigger than the big pitch, or it's smaller than the big pitch?
So it goes small, large, double. And a double is essentially if you could imagine two homes almost conjoined.
Okay, I was just curious because the prices sort of didn't sort of seem quite right.
Well, thank you for the vodka-based explanation of that. Ray, any questions or comments at all?
Not from me.
Okay. Spencer?
Medium, thank you, Chair.
Mary, I know this has
Not
got
me.
some of your residents in the ever-lovely Cliffdale. Yep. Well, I have to say I'm not particularly impressed the rate of inflation went up by 0.5%, but this is unfortunately life, it seems. So I've got a couple of questions. So, again, I know the answers, but I want clarification from you, Sam. So, legally, we have to go with the rate as announced today. That is correct.
So we do have a discretion, so that the maximum we can increase our rates to is the CPI rate that was published today, so that's 3%. We can't exceed that rate.
Right.
There's a discretion that we've applied in years before around actually increasing to a lower rate. That was when we were looking at RPI, and that was at a time when RPI was significantly higher, and we took decisions historically to meet our costs, essentially. That was a discretion that we took as a council. But as is outlined in the report, there are lots of budget pressures facing the service. So with that in mind, we're not recommending that an increase of less than 3% be applied.
And again, this is a service that comes out of what's called the general fund in parlance, which is essentially people's council tax and grants. Is that correct?
So it's a service that's paid for through the pitch fees, essentially, that's
Okay.
paid by residents.
But any shortfall would not come out of people's council rents, it will come out of what we call the general fund. Is that correct?
No, so we wouldn't be taking, no, so no shortfall would come out of the general fund at all. We're not making a shortfall. The service makes a contribution towards fixed overheads.
Okay. What is the downside of sticking with the 2.5% increase?
It potentially invites financial pressure for the service. As we've outlined in the report, there are lots of cost increases that the service is facing, particularly around staffing costs, increases in water rates, increases in repairs and maintenance. We're actually anticipating that those increases will be beyond the rate of CPI. So it potentially invites a negative budget pressure.
Okay, that's fine. We know with things like water bills, they're going through the roof. And obviously there's the employer national insurance contributions, which will affect lots of things as we trundle along, I think, and I'll return to in the next item. Okay, so Alison, I would like to amend recommendation 1 in the light that we've actually got an inflation figure today, which is to delete sentences 2 and 3 in recommendation 1, because they're now frankly irrelevant because of what's done today. And so I want to amend recommendation 1 to a single sentence recommendation, particularly following Sam's advice about the negative budget pressures around costs, particularly water bills, utility bills. We expect energy bills to rise as well, which is, 1 is now agrees to increase park home pitch fees by the consumer price brackets CPI rate as published on the 19th of February 2025, which is 3%. Yeah? Then you delete sentence 2 and sentence 3 from that, and retains recommendation 2. Can't say I'm happy to do it, but I know with those bills that are coming, they're going to be way beyond 3%. And this is another cap that councils have to deal with. We're not a private landlord. So with that, Sally, thank you very much indeed for that. I look forward to the complaints. But there we go. But thanks, Sam. So we now move to item 6, which is, again, fees and charges, 25-26. And who's doing this? Sally or yourself,
No,
Samuel?
that's me again, I'm afraid.
Okay. Nothing to be afraid about. Feel free.
So again, this is a regular report brought forward for decision to present the proposals for private sector housing fee adjustments for chargeable services with a view to achieve full cost recovery. The report brings recommendations that the Cabinet Member for Housing and Tackling Homelessness approves the proposals laid out in the report regarding HMO licensing fees effective from the 1st of April 2025, covering licences due to expire on or after that date. The report also recommends that the Cabinet Member approves the proposed fee adjustments for private sector housing enforcement fees, again effective from the 1st of April 2025. So the background within the report outlines that both HMO licence fees and private sector housing enforcement fees require regular review to ensure these continue to achieve full cost recovery for the council in providing these services. Typically, this review takes place annually. However, due to the introduction of additional licensing and changes made to mandatory licensing in late 2023, which included a review of licence fees, a full review was not required in April 2024. The report explains the legal criteria relating to HMO licensing as set out in the Housing Act 2004 and summarises that in Portsmouth, additional licensing was introduced in September 2023, bringing other HMOs that do not fall within the scope of mandatory licensing into licensing in Portsmouth. Local HMO licensing criteria means that licence holders will either be granted a 1, 2.5 or 5 year licence, depending on their level of compliance, which is assessed through an adopted criteria agreed by Cabinet in 2023. This criteria is designed to demonstrate effective safety and management practices in HMOs, whereby fully compliant landlords are given longer licence lengths compared with less compliant landlords, essentially encouraging well-performing landlords as longer licences are more cost-effective and allowing the council to target its resources best towards poorer performing landlords. The Housing Act allows local authorities to recover their costs associated with operating HMO licensing schemes. Fees will be dependent on how HMO licensing is regulated area to area based on local need. Fees must be reasonable, proportionate, and not to make a profit. Local authorities have a duty to charge fees where there is a lawful mechanism to do so in order to protect the interest of council taxpayers under the general principle that licensing activities should not be funded by the general public. A recent financial review highlighted that several costs incurred by the council in operating these schemes will increase in the new financial year. Most notably, staffing costs have increased as a result of annual staff salary costs, coupled with a recent increase in national insurance contributions. So as a result, in order to continue to achieve full cost recovery, an increase of 11% in HMO licence fees should be applied, which represents an average increase of between £1.43 and £2 per month, depending on the size of the property, based on a 5-year licence. So moving on to the enforcement charges, as well as HMO licence fees, the report covers proposed fee increases relating to private sector housing's enforcement powers under regulatory functions that apply to the entire private rented sector. The ability to charge for this enforcement activity is covered in the primary legislation and explained within private sector housing's enforcement policy. Recoverable expenses relate to the cost of officer time and include the process of identifying the correct legal action, identifying the action covered under the notice and issuing the notice itself. A review of costs associated with carrying out enforcement action set against an existing framework has been carried out, and as with HMO licence fees, a number of costs incurred in carrying out that activity have increased. Again, most notably staff salary costs and employer national insurance contributions. So as a result, an increase of 11% should be applied to the enforcement fees laid out in Appendix 2 of the report in order to continue to achieve full cost recovery. This represents an increase of around £72 based on a typical enforcement action such as an improvement notice. The same principles around HMO licensing apply here in that charging for this activity protects local council taxpayers, particularly where enforcement has been necessary to address a legislative breach. So just in summary, regulatory services detailed within the report have been reviewed and require fee increases in order to continue to achieve full cost recovery. Recommendations are that the Cabinet member approves proposals for HMO licence fee adjustments as detailed in Appendix 1, as well as the private sector housing enforcement fees as detailed in Appendix 2 of the report. Both adjustments should take place on the 1st of April 2025, including licences due to expire on or after that date. And so that fees continue to achieve full cost recovery in future years, these fees should be reviewed on an annual basis.
Okay.
I was going to say, I'm happy to move on to the deputation point.
If you
you'd
could,
like
that
me
would be
to.
very helpful.
Yeah, if I pick up
Please.
bits to begin with, and then I'll pass to colleagues. So I think I'll start by picking up the point around the 6,000 HMO number mentioned in the deputation, which was reflected in previous reports, particularly surrounding the introduction of additional licensing. I just want to highlight that that was an estimate based on a variety of data sources that were available to officers, who acknowledged at the time that that figure was an estimate. Also just want to make really clear that that hasn't made any difference to the way that we carry out licensing, as our resourcing is essentially based on the actual inspections that we do and the activity associated with that. So for example, a 1-year license, we carry out at least 1 inspection, 2.5, at least 2, and so on. In essence, we cut our cloth accordingly based on the demand and the number of officers needed to meet that demand. I should also point out as well that with our schemes, we're committed to inspecting every licensed property at least once during the term of that license, and our fees need to reflect that. That's not a practice that's reflected across all local authorities, so it can be quite difficult to draw a direct comparison to neighbouring authorities. In our model, we've tried to strike a balance between landlords who are compliant and those who aren't, so that's reflected in our tiered system and the licensing fees that sit alongside that. The tiered system itself requires poorer performing landlords to pay more when compared with compliant landlords, as officers recognise that compliant landlords essentially absorb less of the council's resource and therefore pay less overall. A comparison against other local authorities shows that HMO fees in Portsmouth are roughly mid-range when we look to other local authorities, but it's probably worth pointing out that that comparison took place against fees as per their website as of today. It's highly likely that those other local authorities are going through a similar process as we are, so it's likely that those fees will increase in the coming weeks and months. I think at that point, Alan, I'll pass over to you around the 11% point.
Thank you, Sam. Yes, so it's worth just emphasising that the model, that is a rather complex model, as Sam has illustrated, where we try and match the costs across the 1 year, the 2.5 year and the 5-year licence. So I will try and give a simple answer, but it needs to reflect it as quite a complex model. As Sam has said, the fees have not been reviewed since they were introduced some 18 months ago. So that 11% includes 2 pay awards. a flat rate pay award for the current financial year and an estimated flat rate award for next year. And on top of that, again, as Sam has said, increases in employer national insurance contributions that will be brought in from the 1st of April. And for some of the staff that are working on these licences, that is an increase of over 11%. There are obviously other costs which feed into the model, and other variables as the number of licences themselves and the amount of staff that work on them. But again, as Sam has said, that the amount of staff that are employed through the model varies according to the demand put upon them for the various licence types. Pass back to Sam.
No, nothing more from me. Open to questions.
Okay, thank you for that, Sam and Alan. Mr. Anderson, any comments at all? No. Mary? No. Spencer? No. Ray? No. Okay, I have a few. So what you're effectively saying, Alan, is that the 11% rise is over 2 years. It covers 2 years' worth of increases. Am I correct?
2 years of pay awards.
2 years of pay awards.
Yes.
So the staff who are overseeing the service and who are doing the enforcement and who are doing the monitoring and looking after the licensing are subject to the local government pay increase. Is that correct?
That's correct, yes.
Okay, which for those who don't know has been between £1,300 and £2,000 every year for the last 3 or 4 years as they try and retain some differentials with the national living wage. You mentioned £2 a month, Sam, as an increase. Is that £2 a month per property or £2 per month per flat? Sorry, per room or flat, according to it.
Per HMO.
Per HMO,
Per
yeah.
HMO, yeah.
So it's per HMO, not per room in a HMO?
Correct.
Okay, that's also interesting. Those are my questions, if that's all right. So with some comments. I think the fact that this is a rise over 2 years means that this is, whilst not necessarily palatable, this is more understandable. I look forward to see if we can find ways of having rises every year as opposed to every 2 years, because I know that that can be a disproportionate thing. Oh, sorry, I have one more question. Compensation for national insurance. I thought that there was government compensation for council staff involved in the national insurance rise. Does that apply to this type of staff, Alan?
No, it doesn't.
Okay.
So the government's methodology for distributing the compensation looks at the net cost of service for council taxpayers based on expenditure in the last financial year. So it excludes any what we call paid for services where the costs are charged on, in this instance, to licence payers. Okay,
That's incredibly helpful. I mean, the figures I'm currently seeing for the housing revenue account, which is the landlord function as opposed to this function, are around about £1.3 million we have to find, even though we've got some compensation for it. So it's interesting to know that we have to deal with that, as well as with the local government pay rise. As I said, this may not be nice, but it's something we have to do because otherwise the council taxpayer stumps up the cash. And I don't think that's a sensible way forwards if we want sustainable public services. Again, this is not nice, but the truth is this needs to happen. It's been clear for a while that the number of staff that we have reflects the number of HMOs we got. There's no sort of, 97 staff for 6,000 HMOs because we've got to make the money back. The fact that we are not compensated for the national insurance, employers' national insurance changes is sad, I think, but that means it is inevitable that effectively is residents have to pay. But the fact it's £2 a month for a HMO, as opposed to £2 a month for a flat or a room in a HMO, rather changes the tenor of the deputation that's been put forward with some understandable points. And the fact, again, it's over 2 years also changes that tenor as well. So whilst I can't say I like increasing these licence fees, I fear that I have no choice. I say that as someone who is in a HMO that is licensed. However, it's so general because it applies to everybody that it's not a prejudicial interest. But we want to try and drive up standards. We can't have HMOs where there's only one smoke detector for the whole HMO. We can't have that. The good landlords will understand. The bad landlords should be driven out. That's why we brought it in, to increase confidence in people in the city in HMOs. They are a vital part of the housing mix, even though many people don't like them. But the key thing is to make sure they're as safe and as sensible as possible. And so that means paying the money to make sure they're as safe and sensible as possible. So with some reluctance, Alison, I agree to this, to the recommendations. Okay? And so now we move to, thank you, Sam. You can go now. I'm sounding like a teacher, if you wish. We move to the final item on the agenda, which is the gas and repairs contract changes. So again, Adam, Steve, Stuart, or Nicola, who wants to do this first?
I'll take it.
Okay, thank you, Adam.
Right then, so this report relates to the repairs and maintenance and gas repairs and servicing contracts and looks at delivery model review and options appraisal. It's quite a long report, you'll see, and there's an awful lot of appendices attached to it, so I'll try and just pick out some of the key points from each section to hopefully provide a summary, if that's okay. So in terms of the purpose of the report, both our repairs and maintenance contract and our gas servicing and repair contracts all expire on the 31st of March 2026. So this report looks to undertake an options appraisal of potentially different delivery models to understand if there are alternative models that we could employ that could potentially generate efficiencies that would allow further reinvestment back into the stock while still maintaining a good service level to residents. Section 2 covers recommendations, and whilst you'll see there's an officer recommendations given, I should make it clear that we've approached the piece of work around the appraisal from a neutral perspective, and the recommendations are born from the analysis and work that we've undertaken. In terms of the actual recommendations themselves, there's quite a number of them, but I'll just pick out some of the key ones. So 2.3 asks for approval to recommend the delivery model of an outsourced repairs and maintenance contract, gas service and repairs contract, landlord's building repairs contract, and a fire safety compliance contract. 2.3.1 and 2.3.2 covers a proposed lotting strategy, and there's details provided in that. And it asks that delegation is given to us to refine that prior to a formal tender exercise. 2.3.3 outlines that the contracts be a minimum of 5 years with options to extend subject to contractor performance. And then 2.3.4 asks for approval to commence the procurement exercise with a view that contracts will be implemented from 1st of April 2026. And then 2.4 asks for approval to undertake a review of our scope of service and that we bring a report back for decision meeting to potentially look at further efficiencies, but also linking back to my previous the judgment report, potentially providing more clarity to residents around service expectation and levels. Section 3 provides a general background, so it covers off existing contracts, values, geographic areas and works covered at a high level. The main three contracts in terms of our repairs and maintenance and our gas servicing all operate on a cost reimbursable basis. So this means that costs are transparent, with us paying for labour and materials for each repair, with a fixed fee applied on top which covers their overhead items such as senior management, premises and back office functions, and then a fixed pre-agreed profit percentage applied. I think it's fair to say that the nature of the current contracts has led to a true partnership relationship with contractors, and it's allowed us to be very flexible, responding to sort of major issues that have occurred over the previous few years. That includes the Clarion acquisition of 800 additional properties, response to the COVID pandemic, and in instances like the Sarah Robinson House gas issues, and the contractual model that we've employed currently has really allowed that to happen. 3.14 covers off the tenant satisfaction measures in relation to repairs. And again, whilst accepting there's always room for improvement, as have been mentioned previously, they are quite high and indicate that generally there is sort of satisfaction from a resident's perception with the service. Section 4 covers off some of the service pressures that really generate the need to drive efficiencies. So I think the key thing here is all of the the maintenance work we undertake is funded through residence rents. So there's limited scope to sort of increase the funding envelope. We need to live within our means. The stock is reaching a point where it's nearing the peak of its maintenance cycle, and also obviously through increased regulation, through the Social Housing Regulator and the Building Safety Act, there's additional work items needing to be undertaken. The result of this is with the increased demand, and again particularly around building safety, we need to rebalance the allocations between revenue and capital. So currently it's around a 50-50 split, and I think we need to get it to try and move towards 60% capital, 40% revenue. Both the repairs and the gas contracts primarily deal with revenue expenditure. So again, if we can generate efficiencies through those contracts, that should allow increased allocation to capital works. Section 5 covers a range of consultation we've undertaken in relation to the report. You'll see that we've done quite a lot of work with residents, both through workshops and sort of wider surveys. Again, the appendices provide details. I think probably the key takeaway for us was what was coming through as the most important factor for residents was that operatives turn up to appointments when they say they will. However, there was potential for more flexibility in terms of when those appointments are delivered, such as AM or PM appointments, as long as they turn up in those times. And I think obviously residents recognised that certain works should be prioritised, such as fire safety or compliance activities against non-urgent repair work. We did a range of soft market testing with contractors, which showed there's good interest in all areas of work. I think the main takeaway from that is that if we look to maybe combine all the works into one contract, it would limit the market in terms of a small number of contractors who are able to resource a contract of that scale. We did engagement with a number of stock holding authorities to understand how they deliver services. We got around 110 responses and around 50-50 split between in-house and outsourced services. And generally, whichever way they delivered services, it tended to be an historic thing, so they'd always delivered it in that manner. Where services had been brought in-house, it was generally because the service was deemed as failing, and so they were looking to change something to make an improvement there. Section 6 covers a delivery model review. So we looked initially at 5 options, discounting 2 fairly quickly because they didn't really work. So that looked at insourcing the services, setting up a sort of third-party company to deliver them, and then finally looking to continue the outsourcing model. All of the appendices cover off a detailed appraisal of each of those options. But in terms of a very high-level summary, looking at insourcing, the sort of responses from other local authorities in-source showed that generally insourcing does provide or can provide a high level of service. However, when we compared our own current service, we were around 10% higher through our tenant satisfaction measures than other authorities that had an in-source service. We've looked at the costing, and we get to the position of we anticipate an in-source service would be higher than our current costs. And due to the scale of change involved, we would potentially need a 2 to 3 year extension of the current contracts. And this is primarily due to the significance of the change. I think there's nearly 450 staff employed for our service providers that we would need to cheaply through. We'd also need to find new premises. And also there's an awful lot of procurement activities in terms of every aspect of that service. We would have to procure, vehicles, uniforms, materials, all sorts. And I think the recommendation not to insource is based largely on the balance of risk. So, like I said, the current service from our own perception and residents is deemed to be performing reasonably well. And we felt that introducing a change of this significance, the balance of risk would be significant and potentially detrimental to the service delivered to residents and at a high cost. In terms of the local authority TECL company, this potentially was setting up an external company that could generate a profit with that profit reinvested back into the stock. Again, this was considered not viable mainly due to risk. Again, from the sort of analysis, that can work well when you've got a high-performing service already that you're then looking to outsource. Because we're doing it the other way around, we felt that risk, would be detrimental, and also because it's wholly owned by the council, they'd have to mimic PCC terms and conditions, which then again would potentially lead to high costs. So then we looked at outsourcing, recognising that the current provision delivers a high service to residents, although acknowledging we need to generate financial efficiencies, obviously to allow reinvestment. So then we considered potentially looking at different contracting models or lotting options that could potentially help generate some of those options. We've looked at various contracting models, and I think for the repairs and maintenance contracts, we're proposing to maintain the current cost reimbursable nature, and that's because there's a vast amount of repairs which are undertaken quite broad in their range of work, and it's unpredictable. So that contract allows us to respond to that and make sure we're doing the right repair at the right time to a good standard. The gas contract is a lot more predictable, so there are other contracting models there, and we're proposing to change to a price per property model, which through our market analysis we anticipate we could potentially generate some cost efficiencies. Section 10 looks at the lotting strategy, and again we've proposed to maintain an on-island and an off-island separate repairs contracts. That provides us some resilience in terms of having two service providers to undertake our repairs, and also flexibility, should we need to expand or changes happen in the future. We've looked at keeping a combined on and off-island gas contract. However, obviously with the change to the contracting model, that should obviously provide better value. Landlord's maintenance is currently part of one of our repairs contracts. We're looking to establish this on its own lot, and the reason for that is to try and open the market more to more local SMEs. So it's a lower value contract, and potentially we may be able to get better value and a different type of contractor through having that on its own standalone lot. And then the fire compliance lot, that surrounds items such as like fire alarm servicing, testing, dry riser testing, etc., which we're obviously getting an increasing demand for from the Building Safety Act. A lot of those activities are undertaken through the existing contracts, but we recognise the potential market for a specialist or standalone contractor to deliver those services. So we're proposing to have that on its own lot. In terms of Section 11, this briefly touches on looking at the scope of service, and I think whilst we've done this full evaluation around contracting and delivery models, I think there's a piece of work that we could do to further generate savings through looking at the scope of service and also how we deliver the service to residents, which could obviously help with reinvestment. And then finally, Section 11 just provides some of the overall rationale. So it's around continuing the outsourcing of the service, and using lotting options is considered the most effective way to deliver it. And that should hopefully drive value through a competitive procurement process, generate financial efficiencies, allowing funding to be reinvested back into the stock. It provides a good balance of risk by introducing some changes to drive efficiencies without significant changes that would potentially adversely impact service delivery. And it also would allow resilience to be built into the contracting models to respond to any changes that may arise in the near future. Any questions?
Thank you for that, Adam. Mr. Anderson, were there any comments from the consortium or from the residents' repairs panel?
Basically, I think the feeling is if it's not broken, you don't need to fix it. And it seems to be working well as it is now. And it's difficult. I speak about 3 languages, but I had to learn a new one with NECE 3 and NEC 4 and TechCal and all these different things. And I'm glad I don't have to make a decision on it. But I think the final proposal makes perfect sense from most of us. As I say, we're happy with the service, and why take risks?
Thank you for that, Mr. Anderson. I think I speak 1 language badly, so if you could speak 3, that's excellent. Ray?
No, I'm going to say I've had a deep conversation with Adam and the team about this, so all my questions have been answered way before this.
Okay. Are you broadly, so forgive me for asking you questions, you're meant to do that to me. Are you broadly satisfied with I'm going to ask each of the 3 of you, are you broadly satisfied with the general direction of travel here?
I am now, yeah, as I say, up until sort of about the 14th of December, when things completely changed, then I was at different tact. But with what's going on in the next 18 months or more, I think there is only one direction. And I think that's outsourcing, unfortunately, but you know, it's the nature of the beast, and it would make more sense to do it that way.
Okay. Honest answers are always welcome. Spencer.
No questions in terms of the direction of travel. Fine, the proof will be in the pudding as ever with these things.
That's a non-committal answer. I like that one. That's interesting.
I'm a lawyer, aren't I? What can I say? But then you apologise.
Well, thank you. I remember you on my cases. Mary.
This is a huge amount of work, much appreciated. I'm not that happy that we're outsourcing, but it's the way to do it. It's the way that works, so we have to do it.
No, that's fine, Mary, and I think that I know of plenty of people within this authority who have grave reservations about sending anything to the private sector. Usually and that's not just in one political grouping either, usually on the grounds of the councils tend to do it better. With things like the ports, that's created a huge help to us. Keeping our council housing has been a huge help to us. I think with this, I've had three approaches. So as a good Liberal, I don't necessarily believe the state is always great to do everything, and I don't believe the private sector is always great to do everything. So I'm guided by the evidence. I have three principles for this. The first is this going to be a better service for tenants and leaseholders? That's the first thing. Because if it ain't, we scrap it. Don't care. And I'm delighted that we're looking at ways in which we can better meet tenants' expectations. Adam is in the report. Making sure we could do more of the right repairs first time, because that's the only target that anybody should be worried about. And also I like the idea of greater flexibility as well, which is actually trying to make things better, make things actually fit the tenants' and leaseholders' lives, rather than the lives of the producers who are the operatives in this particular thing. That's the first point. Second point, which actually comes from the first. What we find is that actually if you improve the service, you save money. Rather than having to spend money doing it 4 times, you only do it once. Wish the rest of the public sector would take that on board, because life would be a bit better. But I think that's enshrined in this, and that's a principle that's enshrined in this. And then the third point is an avoidance of monopoly. If there's anything one thing worse than a private monopoly, it's a public one, and we have to try and make sure that the structure avoids that. I'm also guided by Councillor Corkery's authored report on repairs and maintenance, which was very clear that the in-house teams run by housing associations were worse than the outsourced teams run by this council, which I think says a lot about culture in particular and around the way in which things are approached. And that also is a big factor in my approach to this. So I think on the balance of probabilities, the outsourcing aspect is the way to go, because the scrutiny report said that the others weren't that good in-house. The next bit is to try and make sure that we improve the service. I also think that the splitting it into different packages increases both the chances of that happening and also increases the opportunity to drive up the social value by encouraging local businesses and local residents to get trained and to actually have jobs. The biggest problem biggest barrier we got to building homes is nobody can build them, because we ain't done enough testing and we ain't done enough training and we ain't got enough people, which is a bit of a shame. So I think that way, by splitting it up into those 5 projects, that does a lot of good work on that. I suspect all of us will be on it like a hawk to make sure that it's done. My 2 final points to relate to what Ray very diplomatically did not say, which is the future of this council. This is one of the major contracts that we have, and we want to try and make sure it is future-proofed against any merger, shotgun marriage, reorganisation, delete according to taste, that we're forced into it. I believe from what you've told me that this will be future-proofed, and that any future arrangements will be fine. It's really important because we've got to make sure that the tenants receive the best quality service regardless of what we're called, who we are, where we're based, or whatever. And I think that also gives me some comfort against some of the things that Ray mentioned earlier. So on the basis that we're looking forward to regular updates and that we avoid the problems that occurred with the previous tenders, then Alison, I'm happy to accept all the recommendations in the report. And here, that means the meeting is over at 5:41 p.m. Thank you for your patience with us, and have as good an evening as you can.